are Vineyard.
Somos Viña.
We are Vineyard.
Let's just say we explored all of the different corners of the Pentecostal, charismatic, choose your favorite term.
Yeah.
But those who believe that the power of God is present in the here and now. I mean, we, consistent with how I talked about my college years, we sampled all. And I would say, and I've said this before to various folks in our movement, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the Vineyard helped save our marriage. Because we were experiencing different pockets of life in the Spirit very, very differently. I wasn't sure, is there a place where you can fully believe in the power of God to heal, to release words of knowledge, to rewire someone's mind, but do so in a way that's grounded in orthodoxy, not extra biblical, but also allows me to show up in the worlds that I generally find myself in.
Yes.
And not be the bad kind of weird.
Yes.
There's good weird, and then there's unhelpful weird. And I think it was in the Vineyard when we walked into a Vineyard church in downtown New York City in 2004. And I realized, there are a people that hold these seemingly contradictory elements together.
Yeah.
And it's been a sort of a long and gradual and joyful journey of not just becoming more deeply involved in the Vineyard, but also working out our faith as a married couple, as individuals, with this family of people who share these common objects of love.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. May is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and in celebration, we're hearing from some of the leaders of our AAPI association. In today's episode, our host Jay Pathak talks to John Kim. John's an investor, an entrepreneur, and a member of the Vineyard USA board. Let's listen in.
John, thanks for joining us to our podcast. You've listened to every single one, right? You're caught up?
Only 98% of them.
Only 98%? 99, 98, yes. 99, somewhere in the 98 to 99 number. Perfect. Good. Well, let's just start where these always start, which is where were you born and where you grew up?
Where I was born is not too far from where I am now. Native New Yorker, born in the Bronx of one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. My parents, in relatively short order, moved from the Bronx to the Queens, which is a standard move for immigrants to upgrade a little bit. And then by the time I was in sort of late elementary, early middle school, I was out in Long Island. And so, spent all the formative years in Long Island doing what Long Island kids do. And then a brief stint in Boston, Cambridge for my schooling. And now I'm celebrating 25 years back in New York City this year. So,
wow. That's 25 years. Okay, so back all the way up to your parents. So your parents are from where?
My parents, they're part of the wave of immigrants that came to the United States in the late 60s, early 70s. Thanks to the AAPI organization, association within Vineyard USA, I'm learning a lot. I thought it was just a coincidence that all these folks came from East Asia at around the same time. But it turns out this was a response, I guess, to some of the political fallout, the PR fallout of World War II. And I think the United States was trying to improve its standing in East Asia. And part of it was to have a more open policy with respect to immigrants from places like China, Taiwan, Korea, specifically South Korea, Japan, coming into the United States. And so my parents were part of that wave of folks who, and obviously South Korea has modernized dramatically. They have some other issues these days with related to their birth rates. But between the time sort of post-Korean War, mid-50s on to when my parents decided to come, which was in the early 70s, that was a dark time in South Korea. So America represented opportunity, possibility. And so they were part of that wave that came with nothing and candidly built something pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Both my parents as well as my in-laws, they have incredible stories of grit, determination, and just unbridled energy and passion to live, which, is something that, we're thinking a lot these days about how to pass that on to our generation.
So they show up in New York City, of all places, and start doing what? Like,
they did a short stint. I think they did a short stint in California.
Okay.
I think my mother did a program in pharmacology at USC.
Oh.
I think my dad, there was a company that sent my dad over, but I don't think he was with them for long. And then he basically did entrepreneurial things, what they call wholesaling. Like, so he imported goods. He still, to this day, my father turned 80 last year, and yet he's still going strong. He's still in the import business. So he brings in goods from various sources in East Asia, trinkets, nothing fancy, but things that, sell. So he wholesales and sells to retail. And he's still doing that after, it's been over 50 years that he's been doing that. So
like what kind, I'm just curious, like what kind, so he's just.
He started with things like handbags, like leather goods. And then he's more in like sort of costume jewelry these days, like stuff that, stuff that's sold at like a mall in Long Island that, he actually does some of the design work, but then has it, produced obviously at a reasonably cost-effective rate overseas, and then resells it, wholesales it here to the retailer, who then sells to the end consumer.
Wow. So
that's his business.
So you are raised watching your dad. Now, is he flying back and forth? Like, is he on the ground looking at the stuff and then? I grew up like most immigrant kids. My dad had like a warehouse that, received all the goods and was his like primary distribution point. This was before things like Amazon logistics and things like that took over. He would source his stuff from Asia. So he would frequently go make trips to Asia. And then, he was, this wasn't like a sprawling enterprise. This is like 10 guys or less. Right. And they would, he would do a little bit of everything. I distinctly remember him, designing things. I would help out when all the bulk merchandise came in, setting it up at the warehouse. He would drive throughout the country to make sales calls, collecting. Collecting was always a little bit of a chancy game. Yeah, exactly.
When you're in the, we call it the subprime section of the market.
Right, totally. So he's like literally personally delivering stuff, picking up envelopes, like doing the whole thing. Always had a team of 5 to 10 guys, also immigrants, he was actually always kind-hearted. I definitely remember him he was very progressive in that sense, I guess. Unlike, and it's understandable, a lot of that wave of Asian immigrants, they came and they felt most comfortable within an ethnic enclave. Yeah. My parents were very progressive. They went out of their immediate circle of Korean Americans and worked with, people of other races, other ethnicities, did business with them, put my sisters and I in an environment that was very much a mixed race environment. And so, I realized, I guess, as I came of age, I realized how much my parents were deliberate about exposing me to lots of different facets. And a place like New York, obviously, you see it all. There's everything from the country club subculture to, working class. I grew up as an athlete, and in general, the best soccer players tend to come from working class homes. Right.
4 homes, a little bit hungrier, a little bit grittier. And they were very deliberate about exposing me to as much as they could, which I think, I really appreciate how they did that.
Dude, that's so cool. Well, and it's the kind of education you don't know you're getting. Like you're getting an education in hustle, grit, flexibility. He's not getting out punching a clock. There's nobody, there's nobody calling him if he doesn't go to work that day. So.
I mean, some of my best memories, I remember I understood the sort of Black Friday, that period between Thanksgiving and Christmas. I don't know if the term flea market is something that our listeners would understand, but there are these places in Long Island where on the weekends, like a big parking lot, like picture like a big Walmart parking lot, gets rented out to various people to just set up shop and, just hawk their wares. And that was a thing. I remember rising at the crack of dawn, it's still dark out. It's, 5 a.m. and setting up the tents that you sold it, before soccer practice. I wasn't, sleeping in. I had to wake up and go help out mom and dad as they were setting things up at the flea market. That was just a part of life. Yep. Yeah. It was hard at the time, but for sure, I'm grateful to have witnessed and, partaken in that.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay. So now how much is church a part of your life? Like, are you like, man, we're in, church because that's what we do? No. Like...
Church is non-existent until pretty much high school. I think I had almost no awareness. I mean, maybe if I'm thinking back, of course, you see churches around you. That some of your friends go to church. I grew up around a lot of the Jewish community in Long Island, and so I knew what bar mitzvahs were. I went to a bunch of them growing up. I knew what a confirmation was. A lot of my Catholic friends went through confirmation, but life with God was nowhere in the grid. The North Star for our family. I mean, my parents, in the sort of Tim Keller vein of or the David Foster Wallace vein of there's no such thing as no worship. Right. We all choose one. It's just a matter of who. I very much grew up in the Church of the American Dream. We came here. My parents came here, sacrificed for the sake of their children. My aunts and uncles and my parents' friends all have very similar narratives. Came here, left whatever we had over there, came here, and we built a life for the sake of our kids. And so you kids better recognize and you better show up and be kind of gratified or justify the way that the sacrifice of your parents. So
that's interesting. But you're in sort of a Korean American enclave to some degree. Some of those folks because obviously they pull together. And there is a strong Korean church. I mean, strong. So you've got to be around some folks that are like, church is like part of what we do, but not really. You're like, I don't even know what those people are doing.
Not until. So I think where life with God and the church enters into our orbit is really late high school. And, for my parents, I think, life was hard. There were struggles. And I think their sort of entry point into life with Jesus, I think was candidly, it was motivated or catalyzed by their struggle and mostly financial hardship. And so they started I would start to see the church community showing up at our house towards later in high school. And then it was interesting. My parents and my sisters, they kind of started to get involved with the local church all around the same time. And this was always interesting. I've been meaning to ask my parents about this. There was no pressure on me whatsoever to partake in this.
So they're just doing something shifts. They start hanging around more, and I imagine Korean church folk. So they're kind of around the house now. You're playing sports. You're in high school, so you're like, whatever. I don't really care what my parents are doing anyway. But then your sister's getting involved. So, but you're watching something happening, but you're not dialed in. You're like, I don't know what
I'm not dialed in at all. What I remember is I came home. This must have been my sophomore or junior year in college. And this is when the NBA decided to take Christmas Day to broadcast like 4 or 5 games. And I distinctly remember at around 10 a.m., my sisters and my parents left for church. I sat on the couch to start watching the NBA on NBC. And I didn't move from my couch until like 8:30. And they come home. I'd watch an entire day of NBA on NBC. They came home and it didn't feel in the slightest unusual. Or I wasn't like, hey,
what happened? Where were you guys? You're like, I don't even care. I'm doing this. And they're doing that, I guess.
It didn't even faze me. And so I think that was my sophomore year, maybe my junior year in college.
Great.
And so, it was. So my family had definitely, it become a central part of their life. But for me, I guess I was still in a different mode. I was still, my mind and my objectives and my hopes were centered on other things.
That's so interesting. So they've kind of groomed you in this success, drive, business, build world. They sort of divert into a more spiritual journey, but you just kind of keep tracking. Because, obviously, people don't know you, or some people would, but many wouldn't. They're listening that you're obviously really bright. You work really hard. You've been successful in your life. So as you're getting to the end of high school, you're not like wondering, should I work at the 7-Eleven or should I maybe go, right? You're looking to launch. You're going, okay.
I'm looking at, my parents, I was raised to take down anything that's in front of me. There was no, there was
Terminator.
It was show up, figure out how to win in whatever environment. It was in the athletic arena. It was in the classrooms. And then, I applied, or I was a athletic recruit for Harvard for soccer. And so it was clear to me that my parents had inculcated a plan in me. Yep. And in some sense, it was, I think that maybe, I don't know exactly. I want to ask them what was going on through their minds, but there was the plan just was proceeding.
Right.
Both for myself and my sisters. So even though my sisters had come to life with God, they had continued in that sort of vein of going to elite schools, entering fields that were not just lucrative, but well looked upon by the rest of society. It was part of the whole American dream was prominent.
It's amazing. Okay, so now they're doing church things. You're not even sure what they're doing. You went to Harvard right out of high school. So now you're hitting the ground running. Now you're with the big dogs too. That's a different experience. Maybe not right away, but you start to realize, wait a minute, there's a lot of really smart, hardworking people in the world. Not just me, because they all collect all in those places. When do you start to go, I wonder how I form a life with God, or maybe there's a life with God that I'm supposed to figure out? How does that start to mess with you?
Yeah, I think colleges, at some level, I'm sure this is still true today. It's a time to experiment. It's a time to be exposed to ideas. At least my experience at college, I don't know how much it's like this these days, but when I was an undergraduate, there was an encouragement to explore. There are worlds and ideas and ways of living that you don't know anything about, but you go to a place. I even though I grew up in New York, I mean, I still went to a relatively small high school. It was it was still, compared to, going to college in Cambridge, where it's not just you have Harvard, you've got all these other universities nearby. And so your world expands. And so I definitely enjoyed the sampling, if you will. I would say the first inkling that maybe life with God is a legitimate option came about when, there was a group of folks from InterVarsity Christian Fellowship that I think they just demonstrated a real genuine kindness. And you have to picture someone like myself who is, not necessarily overly self-centered, but certainly very focused on my ambition. And yet here's a group of people that seem to be living out of a different code. And it was, I found that curious.
Yeah.
I found it interesting. And so that really is probably the kind of like the proximate catalyst. If you will.
And how are you observing that? Were they like in the dorms? They're like friends of friends?
Yeah, friends of friends, just in the dining halls. I mean, I was pretty socially active in college. Like part of sampling what the world offered involved being friends with not just the athletes, not just the applied math nerds, not just one racial group or another, but it was natural for me to make friends with whoever was sort of there. And this group of Christians was just they were just there. Right.
But you can notice there's something different about them, and
they definitely. And some of the things they said, I mean, some folks today might find it a little bit over the top. Things like, what matters most to me is not my future, but my life with God. So picture how a 19-year-old, a 20-year-old kid in my shoes hears that. I'm like, come on, like, what do you mean? You know?
Totally. That's not real. We're Harvard. I mean, give me a break.
Exactly. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? There was one gentleman in particular. He was just very generous. He was genuinely a generous spirit. He wasn't overly concerned with his own GPA or where he was going to go to med school. I think he ended up going to a fine medical school and he's practicing somewhere.
Right.
But he wasn't part of that group that was like, oh, I got to practice. I got to hack the system to make sure I get into the right medical school and get the right internship and get the right, surgery position at some elite university hospital. He was just generous with his time, with his mannerisms. And he was probably he was the fellow that invited me to come to a Bible study. And I think this is where one of the best things about at least my on-ramp into life with God was, just trying to understand the scriptures. And I was a relatively clean slate. Again, not terribly affected by, I had no religious baggage, no church baggage, didn't see some of the things that, kids who grow up in church, maybe they see some of the hard things about how the sausage gets made. I was just like, hey, this guy, Jesus, has some interesting things to say. And candidly, I was putting him next to, I was being exposed to all the great thinkers. And I know you have a philosophy background, Jay, but I was an applied math guy, but I took a lot of electives on just sort of Western political philosophy, moral reasoning. So, I was introduced to the, sort of classical thinkers like the Platos and Aristotles of the world, Enlightenment thinkers. And I was just, I found what Jesus had to say interesting and compelling, just as an offer, if you will, that was distinct from the other parts of the menu that I was sampling.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's so interesting to me, like in this moment that we're in, where everyone's so nuanced and careful about how we say something about faith and in what order, and that it's amazing to me how many times it sounds just like you said, something like, and I was invited to a Bible study. I mean, like in the sort of like scale of evangelistic reasoning, that's like step 87 or something in people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
When actually it was just, we should do a Bible study. And you're like, okay. Or the simple invitation, like, you should come to church with me to Easter.
Yeah.
And someone's like, okay. And then, it's like for all the way, and I know you've done Alpha. This is what I find so amazing about Alpha is it's like, all right, today we're going to talk about how can you trust the Bible? And I remember the first time doing Alpha and thinking, oh no, this is so straightforward. It's so direct. Surely this is going to be a problem. And then just watching people who have no faith going, that's really interesting. I've never thought about it like that. Yeah. Or, why did Jesus die? Huh. Never thought about that. Not sure. And it strikes me even, you're in Harvard where you'd think, man, you have to have some kind of like super sophisticated nuance, like Veritas Forum, complex, like philosophy presentation when actually it's a nice guy who's generous with his life says, you should come to a Bible study.
That's exactly. And look, I got nothing but love and respect for all the folks who are nuanced and doing the work 8 layers deep. But I can't agree enough with that idea that, what? It's just, there's a simple set of things that we just do as humane humans.
Yes.
And it actually ends up going a very, very long way.
It really does. That's so amazing to me. Well, I didn't know that it was that clear for you. I was just talking to a guy I was playing golf with this week. And as we finished talking, he goes, Jay, do you honestly think right now, just sitting here with you, I would just give my life to Jesus? And I said, why not? And he goes, that is so refreshing. Like, I think you really think that's how you really mean it. I go, yeah, I really do. He goes, man, I don't think I'm ready to do that, but that's so encouraging to me that you believe this, that you would just be like, you can just do this. So it's amazing to me how often the stories are actually pretty straightforward. There's any number of other things happening. Who knows how many people are praying for you? I mean, there's all the things in the background.
Yeah. Well, that's actually, that's interesting that you raised that. There's a beautiful thing that transpired recently. So about, I don't know, maybe there have to have been at least 8 or 9. I mean, I would, again, I don't want to go too much into it on this podcast, but I'm a guy enjoying life as a teenager, early 20something in a place like Cambridge, Massachusetts.
I'm filling in the blanks.
And so
okay,
this guy just starts showing up to a Bible study, and I think there are some people that were probably like, "What's that guy doing here? Like, what's his deal? What's his story?" But it turns out there were about 7 or 8 folks that were close with one another who I think they prayed with, and I'm sure their prayers were very pedestrian, but I know they prayed consistently because I ended up coming to faith. I was baptized by actually a fellow by the name of Andy Crouch, who's a good friend of many of us in the Vineyard. Yeah. And it was at the InterVarsity they call it chapter camp, which is their end of year retreat. And at that time, right after I was baptized, they handed me this Bible, and they all wrote a really sweet note in there, basically to the tune of, when we first heard that you were interested in life with God, we were perplexed, but then we've seen you change over the last year or so. And we're just so grateful. And all those folks, it's interesting, as the sovereign Lord would have it, there have been a handful of communities that have reconstituted a lot of us recently. And I actually just took a snapshot of the first few pages of the Bible that had all these folks and the notes they wrote to me. This is in 1995. So almost 28 years ago now.
Wow.
And I just sent it to all of them. And I think it was just the idea that there's the long arc of how God moves was very present in that recent exchange that we had, because we're all in our late 40s,
right?
Early 50s now. And here we are. But yeah, like just simple, humble faithfulness. And, that seed is kind of what it is today. You see the fruit of it. It's a beautiful thing.
Dude,
beautiful thing.
That is so cool. I didn't realize that it was so much IV. That's amazing. And then, and so then do you meet Kara in college?
Kara and I met, after I finished graduate school,
okay,
I left and I sped through graduate school. I took an accelerated path. So I was done in 2.5 years, and then I came straight to New York City. And Kara and I met actually at the first church that I attended when I came to New York City. She had been in the city for a couple years. We graduated the same year from college, but I did a brief stint for my PhD, but she came straight to New York. And so we met at the first church that we were at in the late 90s.
That's so great. Okay. And so you have this faith. Now you've done Harvard, you have business degrees and game theory, right? Was that one of the...
game theory is one of my specialties,
right?
For my PhD, yes.
Okay. So now you're following Jesus, but you're still driving. You're still on a rocket ship. Okay. And so now you're cruising off into business development, any number of the things that you've done with your life, which is incredible. How and when and where do you start to bump into like weird vineyard types and like whatever this thing is called, the vineyard?
So I would say the first moment, this is sort of an important moment because it actually plays into the question of when did the vineyard make sense for me. So I go through college. College is relatively a breeze for me. I know that everyone, there's obviously a lot of very gifted people that land at a place like Harvard, but I felt just as good as I did in high school. I didn't feel that sense of, whoa, I was a big fish in a small pond in high school. Now I'm, medium-sized fish, huge pond. I still felt like, I got this. I'm better than all these folks around here.
Yeah.
It was when I got to my PhD program. So that's even a finer filter. Your first year class, my first year class at MIT has 3 Nobel laureates.
Wow.
So that's how good the people were, the 25 kids that were in my first year class. Wow. And I did not think those 3 were going to be the 3 best.
They weren't even the class. 3 best. Right?
Yeah, those are guys I was like, I can hang with them. There were these other guys that I was like, ooh, I'm not sure I can hang with those guys. But MIT was that first moment that I said to myself, wait, there are people here that are playing a game that I'm not familiar with. Wow. And it was very daunting. And it was actually so daunting. I think I had insomnia for a couple weeks.
Wow.
I couldn't sleep because when you're used to dominating a certain environment, and then I suspect it's like how anybody, we all hit a wall in some sense when you're in either athletic or academic endeavors. But I hit that wall at MIT, and I just said to myself, what is going on?
Yeah.
And at that moment, I had been a Christian for, maybe at most a year or so. And then I'm like, hey, I think we're supposed to pray when we run into these types of walls. And I remember I prayed a desperate prayer at the middle of the MIT Student Center saying, God, if you're real, you've got to rewire my brain, because I'm sitting here listening to these lectures, trying to do these problem sets, and I don't see it. And if I don't see it, I don't think I can last here.
Yeah.
So I prayed that prayer, and I don't know what happened, but what I do know is that everything made sense.
Wow.
After that, everything made sense. I went from the guy that couldn't do anything, was always going to his classmates for help. I became the guy that was helping a lot of my classmates. Not all of them, but definitely the majority of them. And everything made sense. And so that was my first experience of, wait, God is not just a moral code. God is not sort of a distant watchmaker. I mean, again, not to say that that was the view that was propagated in the communities that I was a part of, but like it wasn't a lived experience that
Right.
God could actually be real and break in to the here and now. But that moment set the stage for me. And then it wasn't though until many years later, Kara and I are, we're not married yet, but we're engaged. And she spends a little bit of time one summer at a school of healing that was near the Toronto Vineyard. And that thus began our journey into the world of charismatics.
Wow, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was quite a journey. We could do multiple podcasts on that.
I bet we could. Yeah.
Let's just say we explored all of the different corners of the Pentecostal, charismatic, choose your favorite term.
Yeah.
But those who believe that the power of God is present in the here and now. I mean, we, consistent with how I talked about my college years, we sampled it all. And I would say, and I've said this before to various folks in our movement, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the Vineyard helped save our marriage. Because we were experiencing different pockets of life in the Spirit very, very differently. And I wasn't sure, is there a place where you can fully believe in the power of God to heal, to release words of knowledge, to rewire someone's mind, but do so in a way that's grounded in orthodoxy, not extra biblical, but also allows me to show up in the worlds that I generally find myself in.
Yes.
And not be the bad kind of weird.
Yes.
There's good weird, and then there's unhelpful weird. And I think it was in the Vineyard when we walked into a Vineyard church in downtown New York City in 2004. And I realized, there are a people that hold these seemingly contradictory elements together. Yeah. And it was almost 20 years ago now. And it's been a sort of a long and gradual and joyful journey of not just becoming more deeply involved in the Vineyard, but also working out our faith as a married couple, as individuals, with this family of people who share these common objects of love.
For the 6 weeks leading up to Pentecost Sunday with a break for Mother's Day, we're sharing stories that highlight the movement of the Holy Spirit among us. This is part of the Empowered series that vineyards all over the U.S. are participating in. For more information on this series, check out vineyardusa.org/Pentecost2023 and share your stories on social media using the hashtag VUSAEmpowered. We can't wait to see what the Holy Spirit does during this time. Registration is now open for our 2023 National Conference, Making All Things New. This year's focus is on evangelism, church planning, and global missions, and we're gathering in the beautiful Black Mountain, North Carolina, right outside of Asheville. There's special programming for kids and youth, so bring the whole family. Early bird pricing is available until May 31st, so register today. Link is in the show notes.
You just said a bunch of things that are really interesting, which you're right, would take a long time to unpack. But because, a lot of the folks that, of course, we would talk to on this podcast or in many of these conversations around the Vineyard are ministry-oriented type people. So they were in a Baptist thing, or they were maybe a Pentecostal, and they're going, wow, I found a flavor of ministry that makes sense of my experience from whatever background I'm in. And it's a way that I can express my faith that feels familial, feels like it's intellectually sound and practically viable. And maybe they came in through a charismatic experience, or maybe they were already kind of Pentecostals and now they find a certain kind of sanity or theological grounding. But yours is very unique in that you're saying, okay, there's some way that I operate in the Vineyard that enables me to feel like I can be the business man I am. I can operate within the corporate space the way that I do. And there's a way that my faith makes sense in this kingdom of God theology that works for the work that I do, like the life that I live, the kind of man that I am. Say more about that. Like, talk about that, because I know you and I have talked about that a number of times in different environments, but say more, because there's any number of folks that are business people that are going, okay, so I do this church thing over here because, I love God and, the Bible's helpful and, I pray or whatever. But then I sort of like go over here when it's time to actually do my job. And now I go to work, and this other thing helps, but it's over there. Talk about how you've experienced that.
That posture of there's a thing over here that I do on Sundays and on midweek home group.
Right.
And then there's a different way that I show up. I don't, this is something that it was my observation. That seemed to be the whole sacred secular divide just felt like it was a default. It was not a default theology, but it was definitely a default praxis in the various worlds that I was first introduced to. And that didn't square with me with how I understood the biblical narrative. I tried to, as I looked at the scriptures, it was like, no, there's no, I think, who was it? The theologian Abraham Kuyper would say, there's not every square inch of the earth, the Lord looks at it and says mine. There should not be two selves, like a work self and a church self. And for me, it was very important, and it was a prominent part of my journey that I'm still candidly working out today, which is like, these worlds must be one. It has to be one. And, the world, I don't know how many folks listening, but I've been in hedge funds, private equity, like that world for my entire vocational career.
Yeah.
These are folks that are incredibly commercial, incredibly competitive, kind of trained in a certain school of thought, if you will. And so, but that's my native work environment. And I want to show up there exactly the way I show up. So I want to be able to, and I've done this, I want to be able to lay hands on a colleague and pray for them. Now, it's not the same exact thing as ministry time at the end of church.
Right.
There's a lot of wisdom that goes involved in that. But I need to show up in the office and in the day-to-day such that when a colleague or a business partner is in crisis and we have a moment to talk about it in a private conference room, that if I say, I want to pray for you and I want to ask for the power of God to come into your situation, that first of all, by and large, people have always been very receptive to that.
Yeah.
But everything about my life has to show up consistently so that moment isn't off-putting or in some way non sequitur.
Yeah, just out of sync with how they've experienced it. Right. Yeah.
I think it's either 1st or 2nd Peter. He says, live such excellent lives among the natives, such that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they see your good deeds and glorify the Father upon Jesus' return. And I think that verse has been instructive for me. It's like the way of the kingdom, with its radical generosity, with its sacrificial nature, it is very much at odds. Anyone who thinks it's not at odds with the way of the world is obviously not paying attention.
Right.
And so, but to show up in that way and to be consistent and adhere to that, so that there's I want the environment when I'm interacting with people who are to varying degrees, for the most part in my vocational career, the average person I'm interacting with is probably certainly not super close to God. They're varying degrees of distance from God. But I feel like I need to show up, and I need a faith lens and a praxis that does not seem out of touch or out of sync with the environment that I'm showing up with.
Yes.
So I don't want to be formed by the environment that I'm in, but I actually need to, I think Philip Yancey says, I'm kind of like a spy. So I actually show up in a way that has some familiarity, but there is no doubt when you get close enough to me that my allegiance is to another king, not to the lowercase false king that most of us are worshiping here.
And John, what I would say that I know is true of you, that I find inspiring, is that door swings both ways, in that you're not just saying, okay, how do I bring the kingdom, the life that I experience on a Sunday or in a small group or in a prayer meeting, into the work I do, but the door swings the other way, where you bring the gifts you have to bear in the life of a community. So you have a sharp mind, you have certain kind of leadership tools. There's ways that your mind organizes thoughts, and even like the game theory things play well as you think about strategically thinking about developing a church, or what does it mean for Vineyard USA to operate. And for those that don't know, we've shifted some things to where now it used to be that our executive team was sort of our board, which was sort of, all these things were collapsed in Vineyard USA structure. But now you're a trustee. You're also a vineyard pastor, which we didn't even get to, which, the Lord, in the middle of all this, you started gathering and connecting to people and doing incredible ministry in the vineyard. But you're an incredible trustee because you bring all those gifts with you. So the door swings both ways. It's not just, okay, I've learned some things about Jesus, let me be the best business leader I can be. But the other way around, okay, I'm a pretty good business leader, so I've got some tools. I can walk into the door amongst pastors and leaders and say, hey, here's some thoughts. Here's some ways we should organize. There would be any number of people listening right now that maybe they're a business leader. Maybe they run a company. Maybe they work in the financial markets. Maybe they work in tech, because you're in all kinds of different arenas. What would be sort of your challenge or encouragement? Because, they find themselves sitting in a local church and like, man, that was a pretty good sermon. My kid liked kids' church. Apparently, the pastor wants me to go to this class. I don't know. I suppose I could go to that. But, they're trying to piece together their time, their energy. Okay, what am I guess I'm in this church, but I don't know. Do I really have anything to offer? I'm probably not going to lead a small group. Maybe I guess I could if they make me. I don't know if I'm going to serve with kids. How would you want to expand their imagination for what it means to be in the vineyard, to be a vineyard leader?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've done kids ministry. I think I love it, and it's important. And I've set up the chairs, and I've carried the speakers from, the basement 3 floors down and placed them on the stands, and all that stuff is very, very important.
Yes.
And then at the same time, when I put my pastor hat on and I see a gifted business leader, I do say to myself, I want you to do some of that, but I don't want that to be the entirety of your experience in this local community. And I just think that I think this is a two-way street. I think pastors should look at folks with business skill and business acumen as they should be invited into the conversations where they can be helpful. I think if you're somebody who's, and no one's destined for commercial success is 99% grace for anyone. Like I know that there's preparatory tracks and so forth, but there's, for every success story, there were 99 stories just like that went sideways. So we have to be humble about these things. But I think if you are fortunate enough to have established some commercial success, I think there's a lot of avenues to invest in younger folks who are thinking about those same things.
Yeah.
The space of what it means to follow Jesus in the marketplace. It's the thing that I've been spending the last 25 years candidly trying to work out. But here's one thing I will say. the business world, as we look out into the horizon, what I do think is that the most valuable business leaders, so everyone's got the same training.
Right.
And you know what? Part of the, one of the things I observed at the World Cup, why was the World Cup so competitive this year? Well, it's because the same training techniques are used everywhere in the world. And
Right.
guess what? In every part of the world, people are just people. Yeah, maybe there are some African nations that are more gifted towards long distance running, but by and
Right.
large, once the knowledge and training techniques are out there, looks like the whole world has caught up to Germany, to Spain, to Brazil, and France. And so the same thing is true. The business world, all the techniques are now out there for public consumption. What is it that will distinguish business leaders who are made in the image of God and deliberately trying to follow the Lord? I would say that being able to distinguish between good ideas. So Harvard and MIT and Stanford will give you a menu of good ideas, but only those who are discerning, only those who are wise, only those who have deliberately sacrificed to get close to Jesus and have the mind of Christ, they will be able to navigate situations that the systems of the world and the knowledge of the world do not know how to distinguish between good paths and God paths. And that's something in terms of what you can offer. One, I think we can all grow in that, but to develop learning communities around that skill of distinguishing ourselves because of our intimacy with Jesus, this is not a health and wealth thing, but this is about what does it mean to be wise and discerning. My wife, Kara, actually coined the phrase for me. She's like, there are good ideas and then there are God ideas. Yeah. And I think that's the Vineyard. We in our movement, we have a way of doing intimacy and life with God that sets us up very well for this. And I'm certainly, I'm still in the game as much as I was. I have a little more. I was explaining to somebody the other day, if I was exclusively a player on the field in my 20s and 30s. Now I'm doing a little bit of playing, but a little bit more coaching, even a little bit of GMing from time to time. But I'm still in it. Right. I'm still in it and still working this stuff out. But I think that's a way that I'd love to see our movement's DNA sort of propagated through our business leaders in our community, and then they can shepherd others along those similar lines.
Well, and I agree. As far as like mentoring needs in a church, like when you think about who really just needs some people to come alongside and say, hey, come on over here. Let me help you think about this. There's only so many pastors. And it's not a lot, frankly. It's a really low number of people that are going to do pastoral ministry, like really small. The amount of people that are going to work in jobs, like non-ministry jobs, is like everyone else. Okay. So as far as like creating culture for meaningful living, for a pastor to do that, to be able to look at a few business leaders that have a real life with God, who have some skills they've learned along the way, and say, can you help me with some of these younger men, these younger women that are coming through college, or, they work in a job, they're fairly competent, they're thinking about, could they strike out? Could they start their own business? Or maybe they're not going to start their own business, but they're trying to lead in a corporate structure, and they're trying to figure out, how do I manage people in a way that cares about them, that demonstrates the kingdom? And there's any number of books, of course, that can write about these things, but there's nothing that substitutes mentoring, sitting together, praying, problem solving, talking through stuff. And I think a lot of business leaders think, well, I'm not going to lead worship. I'm not going to preach. I suppose I can serve. But this other little thing you're talking about, mentoring, noticing, developing, equipping, training. Of course, these are the types of folks that tend to get tapped to be on boards for churches or for nonprofits. And honestly, you should probably do that. If you have the tools, it really does help a local church to have a sharp business mind sitting there when you're thinking through purchasing a building, when you're thinking through building a salary package, when you have sort of a legal challenge that you have to do something about. Pastors, like, they don't have any of those tools. They're going, I don't know. I guess I got a lawyer. Should we get a lawyer? I don't know where to get, to go to the yellow pages. But to have somebody who's kind of like, no, I know how to do this. There's a way to do this. There's a way to think through how your HR works. Let's go consult with the right people. That's invaluable. But this other thing you're describing of mentoring, training, developing, coaching younger leaders that are developing, man, it is a huge gap. I think it's just a huge gap.
I mean, I think this is what Jesus did. He noticed who around him. I mean, we have tons of botanical analogies in the scriptures around the soil and casting of seed. I would encourage folks to just notice who's showing up in your communities. And Jesus noticed, he selected, he showed some intentionality, and then he demonstrated. He demonstrated these things. And we do a great job of that in our movement around things like how to pray for people, noticing who might be a great small group leader. And these, again, those are all great things. But I think, being able to apply those same principles, the principles of Jesus around noticing, around selection, around demonstration, what we apply to how we do power ministry, we should apply that same basic framework to how we think about shepherding and developing leaders in the marketplace. It's a unique set of tools, and we have a unique set of practices and DNA that's been sown into our movement over the brief time we've been around that I think is really ripe for this moment in business as well.
Well, and you've said that to me multiple times. When we'll be alone, you'll say, Jay, I don't know that you understand how valuable what we are in the Vineyard is to just the world. Forget about the church. Like, the ability to believe that God is alive and speaking and active in a moment, can offer peace, can calm anxiety, can, even so much of the spiritual formation work that we've been doing in the Vineyard, of course, our mutual friend, Jared Boyd, and any number of others that have said, these things dovetail together. And over, every time we're together, you're like, Jay, listen, this is so valuable. I'm like with young entrepreneurs trying to teach them how to pray. I'm trying to get them to just still their minds to hear from God. And it's like mind-blowing to them because they don't have it.
No one ever told them this stuff. And and I think it's interesting you mentioned, I think the way that as I've observed in our movement, I think we've embraced the gifts of the contemplative tradition and the charismatic tradition. And Jared's done a great job of this, of just showing how they go hand in hand. Yeah. And especially for young entrepreneurs, business leaders, I mean, their lives are hectic. Yeah. Honestly, half of what they need to do is just tune out the noise. That's why they're going to a lot of these sort of mindfulness apps that are out there, which, I'm not going to dog them. I mean, they probably have something to offer, but we have this is a different offer. We're not just quieting down just to hear our inner voice. We're quieting down to hear the voice of God. And there's actually time-honored practices, that are from the contemplative tradition. When you merge it with the way that we think about how God speaks and how God moves in the here and now, it's a fundamentally different way of showing up in the workplace, showing up as a business leader. And I can't stress how much there are various communities that I'm involved in, comprised predominantly of business leaders, and they're always amazed. I mean, I just show up and do stuff that's really par for the course for anybody who's deeply familiar with our movement. And all I'm doing is showing how that can be present, how to make those same principles present in a business environment. And it's they're always just like, we've never seen this kind of stuff before.
Yeah. Well, I'm waiting on the Lord, hearing from God, dialing down, not dialing up. And I think your thought about just being able to seek the wisdom of the Lord, like how God can actually help you make some decisions. You're thinking through, like, what do I do to manage this person? There's obviously something else going on here, or there is some kind of a strange structural thing with how we're trying to structure this part of our business or this part of the company. And God, how would you want us to structure this for the greatest flourishing of these people and of this company? Mm-hmm. Those aren't small thoughts. Those affect people massively, change the way their lives work. Those are really challenging thoughts. So if you're a business leader, we'll just finish with this. If you're a business leader and you're hearing me right now, what would be your challenge, your encouragement to them? Okay, so I am a corporate person. I work in IT. John, I'm listening to you. I'm realizing my life's frantic. What would you want to do? What am I supposed to do? What would I do differently?
Well, this is going to be a shameless plug for the Order of the Common Life. But
yeah, good. Do it.
I think Jared has created a great set of on-ramps for people.
Yeah.
There's a rich tradition that we can draw from.
Yeah.
Jared's not trying to reinvent the wheel. He's simply trying to reimagine, what does this tradition have to offer for this moment?
Yeah.
And we all know that, we're in a charged moment in so many different ways, but specifically business leaders, there's just a lot of noise because there's so much pressure.
Yeah.
There's so many demands. And the only way to be able to be wise, discerning in how we make decisions is if we get close to God. And there's a whole set of on-ramps, starting with like the contemplative foundation. What does it mean to notice your life? What does it mean to notice yourself? Like, what does it mean to slow down and to invite the Lord into these very real and tangible things?
Yeah.
See, the thing I love about this is business leaders, anytime you run a business, the market's a brutal thing at some level, but it's also an interesting mechanism because it forces you will see the fruit of your actions and of your, what you attempt to do in due time. There's no 10-year waiting period, which is a whole separate reality. Kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. The reality is an incredible force that is at work at all times. And so part of what the encouragement I would challenge is we need a way. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray. That's probably my greatest sort of challenge to young entrepreneurs is like, Jesus was way busier than you, but he often withdrew to lonely places to pray. So we need a practice. We need to, in some sense, we need to normalize withdrawing to lonely places, to dialing down, tuning out all the noise, and figuring out how we're going to get close to Jesus, because it's just important to get close to Jesus. But then we need to bring the things that are actually plaguing us or on our minds, the weighty decisions that inevitably are a part of life in the business world, and bring those before God, and let's see what he says. Let's get good at hearing the voice of God over all of the other voices. And it's a worthwhile challenge. And your mileage may vary. Again, this is not, if you do this, your P&L will explode, or your revenue will explode, or your stock price will go up. That's not at all what I'm advocating. What I am advocating is, the promise of John 10:10, life in all its fullness. This is the way. This is the way. If you're a business leader, you're going to experience life in all its fullness, the full promises of the kingdom in the specific business environment, business context in which you've been placed.
It's good, man. Well, I took a lot of your time. I really appreciate making so much time. That's a great place to land. And I'd love to be able to come back and bother you more about some of the nuances with this at some point.
I'd love to do so.
Yeah,
I'd love to do so.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate it.
No, okay. God bless you guys. God bless everyone out there.
The We Are Vineyard podcast is a production from the team at Vineyard USA. If you've been enjoying the podcast, here's a few ways you can help us. Leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. This helps more people find us. Connect with us online for additional resources. Our website is vineyardusa.org, and we're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at VineyardUSA. Thanks for listening. See you next week.